Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, commonly shortened to Ghazghkull Thraka, is a powerful prophet of the Wavog and an orc warlord of the Goth clan. In the late 41st millennium, he is the most powerful orc in the galaxy, with billions of greenskins marching to war in his honor. Since his ascension to power, Ghazghkull has conducted a slew of devastation missions. He's broken Eldari war hosts, exiled demon hordes, and reduced phalanxes of Necrons to sparking splinters. His most important conflicts, however, have always been against the Emperor of Mankind's servants. Countless worlds of the Imperium have been set ablaze in Ghazghkull's wake, and the powerful hive world of Armageddon has been reduced to a never-ending cauldron of savage struggle during the Second and Third Wars for Armageddon. Ghazghkull, on the other hand, is unsatisfied. Gork and Mork have bigger plans for their prophet, intentions that they feel fit to reveal amid agonizing visions of a cosmos engulfed in green fire. Ghazghkull is starting his most important endeavor at their request. He'll roam the galaxy, subjugating every warlord and rallying every orc beneath his banner until the stars themselves tremble at the sound of his horde's thundering footsteps. Ghazghkull is assembling the Great Wavog. Of Gork and Mork themselves, a Wavog that will engulf the galaxy in a war so massive that the gods themselves will pull themselves out of the warp to join the fight. The savage orcs have long been underestimated by the galaxy's other powerful starfaring species, both in the 41st millennium and throughout history. While everyone has come to fear the Greenskins' migratory crusades for their destructive power, these are only fleeting events. They surge across a few star systems before stopping, their march ebbing and eventually receding until they are reduced to a footnote in the history of another race. The Wavog, led by Ghazghkull Thraka, on the other hand, is unique in that this war boss is the most dangerous orc alive. His Great Green Crusade isn't just a planet-crushing operation. It's an invasion that will shatter the galaxy's foundations in a struggle for absolute dominance. Orcs aren't bound by history as a species. They don't honor or record the past in any way. Greenskins are animals who exist in the present, now and for it. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, the orc's full name, is deadly because he has vision, not just for the present, but also for the past, and most crucially, for the future. After all, he is the living prophet of the orc gods Gork and Mork, not just an ordinary orc. Ghazghkull is the manifestation of their great weapon of destruction, history of the past. The term Ghazghkull is uttered in scared whispers in many alien languages at the end of the 41st millennium, a name synonymous with dread across the cosmos. It wasn't always like this. The greatest orc warlord in history started out as a common orc warrior grinding it out on a backwater world. A now frozen ball at the farthest edge of Segmentum Solar was formerly the sporadically populated orc planet of Uruk. It was named Eurycleas after an exploration fleet launched from Terra during the Dark Age of technology. Its history has been largely forgotten, buried beneath successive invasions, but it was first named Eurycleas after it was founded by an exploration fleet launched from Terra during the Dark Age of technology. It was part of the Zornian system, and the warp tides poured in from all directions, making it an ideal hub. Humanity thrived on Eurycleas since it was a mineral-rich world, and the colonies grew to be thriving towns and bustling spaceports within a few hundred Terran years. The orcs were certainly attracted by the lights and activity. They spread like wildfire across Eurycleas. They leveled it before vanishing aboard their massive junk fleet, riding the warp tides in search of new adventures. The Greenskins, as is their wont, unknowingly left behind remnants of their reproductive fungal spores, and they would rise again one day. The livable Zornian system would inevitably be discovered by spacefaring cultures due to the flow of the warp. During the barren eras, the world became an Eldari outpost, a Spindorian's home, and a Etrud warren. The long-dormant orc spores would occasionally explode, spawning swarms of greenskins in some obscure region of the world. Mankind did not return in full force until the period of the Great Crusade. The Dark Angel Space Marine Legion was responsible for clearing the planet of all life forms and replanting the human flag. Uruk was given to the planet once more. Humanity mined there for nearly 2,000 standard years, constructing hive cities and connecting spaceports to its twin moons. Minor Xenos incursions happened, but it wasn't until the War of the Beast, near the middle of the 32nd millennium, that a massive greenskin Wavog swept the system. With dozens of invasions raging throughout all 5 segmentums, it was the largest reported orc onslaught on the Imperium at the time. The Zornian system was soon enslaved by orcs. The remaining survivors of Uruk boarded the massive starship Dominion and escaped into the abruptly changing warp as the planet was overrun by greenskins. The warp's tides had changed, and the Zornian system was no longer easily accessible. For the orcs, this marked the start of a protracted era of stagnation. Uruk, renamed Urk, was a battleground for warring greenskin tribes for approximately 8,000 standard years. They fought over the ruins of human hive cities at first, competing for the greatest riches. These battles deteriorated, as did the loot they battled over. The wars persisted as the millennia passed, because no single leader was large enough to unite more than a few tribes or clans under him. A state of squalor became the norm. Small orc warbands battled it out for control of a decreasing pile of scrap iron and abandoned machinery. Ghazghkull was born into this hopeless circle of senseless warfare, a weird road to greatness. In a strange twist of fate, the Imperium of Man may have unwittingly helped to create the most powerful orc of his day, if not all time. The Imperium had learnt over many Terran years of combating orcs and monitoring their presence in distant systems that even irregular orc populations could increase with astounding rapidity under the appropriate conditions. The ascension of a powerful warlord could bring the feuding clans together, resulting in a massive spore release. If this gathering grows large enough, it will operate as a psychic beacon, pulling orcs from adjacent planets into a swarming migration of terrifying intensity. Orcs might go from being a minor annoyance to the world's dominating species in less than a Terran decade. The Imperium has discovered that the orcs can be broken and scattered at a low cost if a rising Wog can be spotted and stopped early enough. Various watchposts are so placed in star systems known to be troubled by greenskins. The Dark Angels had created a network of surveillance stations across the Zornian system, which were controlled by a command center in a barren mountainous section of Urk. This hub sent scans and other data to the nearest Dark Angels vessels on a regular basis. The Dark Angels could maintain track of the feral human populations of that star system in this fashion, and the greenskin numbers could be checked on a regular basis. They were always looking for new recruiting worlds from which they might pull battle-tested warriors. Ironically, it was this very monitoring station that launched Ghazghkull's career. Ghazghkull was first mentioned 9 Terran years before the Second War for Armageddon in 932.m41. Ghazghkull, a stripling warrior, was a trooper in a Goth clan warband that raided the Space Marines' command sanctum. It was not safe from the orcs, even if it was hidden atop a distant rocky crag on Urk. The greenskins, always looking for a scrap, discovered the concealed base and attempted to dismantle it, setting off the base's auto-defense system. Ghazghkull was hit in the head by a bolter shell during the initial rush to seize the base, pulverizing a big chunk of his cranium and turning a large portion of his brain to mush. If it hadn't been for 2 circumstances, the young and profusely wounded Ghazghkull may have been left for dead right then and there. Ghazghkull rose to his feet, displaying the tenacity and grit that any Goth admired. It was also commonly known that a particularly delirious Deathskull's painboy rewarded people who gave him new material to work with. Ghazghkull's own crowd guided him onwards, so the carrion birds didn't dine on him that day. They ultimately arrived at the Deathskull's outpost of Rustspike, where he was a stumbling wreck who had to hold his bleeding brains in with both hands. There, Ghazghkull was traded to Mad Doc Grotznik for 3 teeth, and a new choppa by his own mob. Stunning green visions. Green visions of the orc gods Gork and Mork appear to Ghazghkull. Ghazghkull awoke from his daze as soon as Mad Doc Grotznik completed his crucial operation. Grotznik had replaced part of the Goth warrior's skull and brain with bionics, wires, and squig sinew, and had riveted it all in place with adamantium plates, so he awoke as a surprise to both sides. More astonishment ensued. Ghazghkull's vision was clearer than it had ever been. This had nothing to do with his vision or his new bionic eye, which was usually slightly out of focus. Ghazghkull awoke with a whole new vision for the first time in his brief life. It was his destiny to rally all of Orkdom and lead them on the greatest Wavog of all time. Ghazghkull now believed he was in direct communication with Gork and Mork, the orcs' great green gods, and that he had been chosen as the living incarnation of their heavenly wishes. They wanted him to pave the way for the galaxy's most epic wars. Trademarks, the Deathskull's warlord, was the first to fall under Ghazghkull's ironclad heel. When Trademarks approached, Ghazghkull had just emerged from Mad Doc Grotznik's filthy tent and was still scratching his gleaming adamantium-plated patty. Trademarks demanded to know what a Goth was doing within the borders of Rustspike, striding down the street that ran between the corrugated shacks of the defunct Deathskull's garrison. His entourage of knobs guffawed behind Trademarks, anticipating a little of sport. Ghazghkull advanced, knobby fists clenched, unfazed by the giant cobbled-together combi weapon that the Deathskull's warlord was waving in his direction. Trademarks opened fire, anticipating such a maneuver from a Goth. Every barrel of his custom weapon began to burn, filling the air with flying projectiles and emitting dazzling strobes of light from half a dozen gun muzzles. Although explosions exploded at his feet and bullets stitched patterns alongside him, Ghazghkull advanced unharmed. Perhaps it was a sign from Gork, or even Mork, a heavenly intervention to spare their prophet. The last of the wasted shells clattered to the ground. The whirling whir of empty ammunition hoppers, a few desperate trigger clicks, the heavy tread of iron boots, and eventually a rusty squeak as Trademarks' iron jaw dropped open were the only sounds. The thrashing Ghazghkull inflicted with his bare hands was so brutal that Trademarks' knobs celebrated despite themselves. With a thunderous clang, Ghazghkull's newly armored skull launched a headbutt to end the job. Ghazghkull, straddling his foe's pulped body, declared that this was only the beginning. He yelled to the gaping onlookers that he was the prophet of Gork and Mork, and that if anyone was searching for some of the devastation he had just delivered to their former warlord, they may step forward one by one or rush all at once. He didn't care. He had taken over as the true ruler of Rustspike after another hour of strong fighting, a struggle in which Ghazghkull did not sustain any more than a scratch. Though their damaged and battered features made it difficult to see much, it appeared to his new disciples that Ghazghkull grew larger before their eyes. Ghazghkull began to expand his army by crushing the tribes within reach of his new fortress. There were now several Goth groups beneath the young warlord, in addition to the Deathskulls that had followed Trademarks. Orcs began to leave their tribes and go to Rustspike as word of Ghazghkull's exploits spread through Urk's scraffy towns and ramshackle strongholds, hoping to be a part of something bigger than their own gloomy warbands fighting over the same old scrap. They wanted to fight this new boss, who claimed to speak with Gork and Mork and boasted that they would find richer targets one day. Ghazghkull moved west after Rustspike became so crowded that spitting and hitting the ground became impossible. Ghazghkull's first setback occurred in the shattered plains of Da Big Wasteland. He'd entered the Bad Moon's domain, the wealthiest and most envious of the local clans. War boss Snazdaka led the Bad Moon, and no one could match his bright yellow Battle-Lagan Brigade's combination of firepower and mobility. Snazdaka ordered his totem pole hoisted and the tents destroyed when he saw Ghazghkull's troops marching across his territories, and the tribe was on the move faster than a runtherd could choke a stray grot. Snazdaka and his boys were always able to lob a few shells into Ghazghkull's horde before fleeing out of range of reprisal in the ensuing engagements. Ghazghkull had already demonstrated his superior brawling abilities by overwhelming, bludgeoning, and working over anyone who dared to question or resist him. Now, on the other hand, he was in a war of wits and strategy. The up-and-coming warlord would once again demonstrate not only his dominance, but also the kind of violent showmanship that causes orcs to throw their fists in the air and cheer wildly. Ghazghkull unleashed a slew of countermeasures within days, each of which would have been too much for the Bad Moons to withstand. Snazdaka's battle wagons were refueled at supply depots, which he had his lads sabotage. Ghazghkull then measured the wind and ordered the burning of various shantytowns. The dense, bitter smoke spread across the shattered plains, concealing his troops' movements and preventing the Bad Moons from fleeing until Ghazghkull's infantry was almost on top of them. Ghazghkull had most impressively forced the fastest orc on Uruk to join him by outracing him in a one-on-one speed contest. Only the holy strength of Gork and Mork could have permitted the now hulking Goth warlord to outrun Grand Speed Boss Shazfrag of the Evil Sons, according to everyone who witnessed it. Ghazghkull's strategies all worked, wearing out the Bad Moons to the point where defeat was inevitable. Ghazghkull commanded the Bad Moon mechs to create a gigantic power claw from the ruins of their destroyed tanks as the dejected Snazdaka looked on. All of the planet's Bad Moons aligned as well. Ghazghkull's horde had grown so big that no warband on Uruk could hope to withstand his sweeping assault. Only the ignorant or the stubborn dared to stand in the way of this great greenskin champion's stratospheric climb. Snakebite warboss Gredbalg was one such obstinate jerk. Ghazghkull had to decapitate the scarred old monster twice before ultimately earning his loyalty, and it took a long, bloody solar week to subdue the snakebites under Gredbalg. When Ugrak, the hulking Goth champion, challenged him to a headbutt, Ghazghkull was like a piledriver, plunging his opponent a full foot into the ground and knocking him unconscious. Ugrak's Nob's mob was so taken aback by the loss of their unbeaten commander that they failed to notice Ghazghkull approaching them. Ghazghkull ripped through the Nobs in a rage, robbing them of their senses. When Ugrak and his Nobs' minds eventually cleared, they wisely pledged their eternal fealty to Ghazghkull. For nearly 8,000 Terran years, battles of attrition had raged across the surface of Uruk, with little tribes rising and collapsing, pounding themselves and those around them into submission. No great leader had ever emerged from the never-ending cycle, and none had ever been able to bring the tribes together. That is, until lately. The fate of Ghazghkull, personal backbanner of Warlord Ghazghkull. Ghazghkull took 6 standard years to completely subdue Uruk. He basked in his dominance, now larger than any warlord ever seen on the Earth. The orcs swarmed over the planet's surface in a flurry of activity, inspired by the spirits of the rising Wavog, and Ghazghkull's ardent talks about conquering the stars. As orcs from all around the Zornian system heard the siren call of a Wavog, a sprinkling of rickety void ships began to arrive. For the first time, groups of mechs collaborated, constructing in hitherto unimagined ways. They'd never been able to pool their little resources before, but now all of the Scratheeps were working as one. As they cobbled together gigantic battle fortresses, new weapons, and towering engines of death, crazed energies surged. The sun flickered, and all of Uruk's greenskins moved with a sense of destiny, an overwhelming realization of their duty, their whole reason for existing. The greenskins all looked up at the unexpectedly dimmed sun that had always shone brightly on Uruk's planet. Except for Ghazghkull, everyone was terrified. The superstitious orcs laid down their weapons and spanners and gazed upwards, slack-jawed in amazement at the cosmic spectacle. The sun flashed, burned, and its rays blinked once again. Ghazghkull told the trembling greenskins that this was a sign from Gork and Mork in his booming voice. It was telling them that it was time to leave Uruk behind, that the galaxy needed to feel the increasing power of the Wavog. A single ray of green-tinted light illuminated the prophet of the great green gods as the warlord spoke. He instructed his supporters to collect as much ammo and weapons as they could because they were leaving in a week. Some greenskins worried how this could happen because there were few operational aircraft on Uruk, and the mechs had only recently begun to create more. A single stare from Ghazghkull, on the other hand, was enough to hush their questions and instill in them a fear of questioning how such a thing could be accomplished, if not confidence. There was no sunrise the next day. However, it had nothing to do with Uruk's son's odd behavior in this occasion. The warp currents had reverted to patterns similar to those seen in the past. The warp had delivered a massive space hulk into real space, spitting forth the composite voidcraft in the Zornian system. While the tides of the warp roiled and twisted, the hulk was now drifting in Uruk's orbit, shutting off the sun's fading light. Exodus. Ghazghkull turned to his mechs as solar flares and radiation storms erupted from Uruk's tormented sun, ordering them to secure the space hulk with super-heavy tractor cannons. A handful of the available ships had harpoon rockets, which they used to attach the monstrous space hulk to one of Uruk's twin moons. The space hulk was pinned for the time being, but no one knew how long that would last. The surviving orcs raced to aid the mechs under Ghazghkull's commands. They worked around the clock to build as many rudimentary transport ships as possible. There were probably 100 structures worthy of being termed ships, while others were created for a single journey only. There were hundreds of these rudimentary rockets, each one unable to steer and crammed with orcs and equipment in every hold and crawl space. Ghazghkull led the great evacuation from the planet to take the space hulk, boarding the largest of this ramshackle fleet. The departing void craft flooded the sky with exhaust flares and more than their fair share of premature detonations and mid-air crashes. Some spacecraft collided with the space hulk's outer decks and detonated, ripping the superstructure apart. A few rockets sunk deep into the monstrosity to deliver their orc cargo, while the most well-built ships were able to fly around the gigantic space behemoth looking for landing spots, or, at least, enter the hulk through the massive holes ripped into it by the less fortunate orc rockets. Unfortunately, the space hulk was not unoccupied, as is so often the case. The initial wave of orcs were ambushed by demonic forces as soon as they landed. Burna Boys had to go from slashing metal to defending themselves against a swarm of demons as they sliced their way through bulkheads. As the Burna Boys traded searing death with prancing pink horrors, gouts of dirty orange flame were matched in turn by magical blue jets. Speed freaks sprang themselves from cargo ramps, racing down huge halls with guns blazing, before their ships had even settled. Only about half of the orc ships were able to relaunch, but they disengaged to return to Uruk's surface and transport more greenskins into the combat. The battle lasted several weeks, during which billions of greenskins were transported from Uruk to join the war. The spearhead commanded by Ghazghkull fought its way to the heart of the space hulk. An ancient voidcraft, none other than the enormous star freighter Dominion, stood at the black heart of the confused mixture. The voidcraft went lost in the warp after fleeing Uruk, then known as Eurycleus, to avoid the orc onslaught. It scared human cargo, attracting the hideous creatures who lived there. The Dominion had gone home, but there was now a massive warp rupture where its warp engines had once been. A darksome hole from which the Immaterium's energies spilled forth. The battle to reclaim the space hulk from the demons was a tumultuous journey through ever-shifting limits. Neither side was merciful, slashing at one another in the tight hallways and turning large cargo bays into slaughterhouses where entire armies collided headfirst. Newcomers would occasionally join the battle, such as a new wave of demons sweeping from the space hulk's core, or an orc rocket bursting through to deliver its life payload. Slowly, the orcs forced the demons back, but there was an ambush at every turn, and fatalities were terrible. Mad Grotznik was the one who led the charge to reclaim the landing bays of what had to be an ancient Imperial ship. The skeletons of their long-dead pilots still filled the landing craft berthed within. The few remaining landing boats were commandeered to assist in the transport efforts. The Goff Knobs mob, Ugrak's Uglies, fought their way into the asteroid lodged deep within the Space Hulk. They fought power claws against hellblades in magma-worn tunnels, and in the end, only Ugrak's combi scorches swept the route clear. Battlewagons lowered their def rollers to squash all opposition in the bigger holes, only to be countered by soul grinders, enormous demon engines with metal claws that shredded Orc vehicles. Orc tankbusters were soon on the search for the soul grinders, burrowing through air vents to send rockets corkscrewing into their unnatural opponents and ripping them apart in a hail of ichor and flame. The mechs arrived behind the front lines of battle, welding over repairs, resealing airlocks, and fixing their wrecked war engines. Ghazghkull directed his entourage massed firepower against the tier in reality, having driven the demonic hosts before him. This, much to his chagrin, had no effect. Ghazghkull attacked the rent with a bestial growl and raw green energy spilling from his repaired skull. To enrage the warlord even more, his power claw failed miserably, and in response to an enormous challenge, Ghazghkull unleashed the entire force of his best headbutt. The fissure finally closed into itself after a flash of green and a loud pop. Whether it was the force of the hit or Ghazghkull's latent psychic energy, the demon menace was over, at least for the time being. The Space Hulk, dubbed World Killer by Ghazghkull, was now under Orc command. World Killer moved back into the warp just as superheated gas clouds raced across Earth. World Killer's warp journey, Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, the warlord of Armageddon, has arrived. It is unknown how long Ghazghkull and his followers were lost in the warp. There's a peculiar sense of time passing there, and Orcs don't keep records. They scoured the enormous Space Hulk for odd technology, including ancient devices from humanity's lost past and other technologies beyond their comprehension. This wandering hunt included nicking everything not fastened down for some, particularly the Deathskulls. The Orcs were able to appropriate everything, no matter how well secured, because they operated with burnaboys, whose arc welders ripped through metal. Many mechs began working on a force field projector at Ghazghkull's command. Meanwhile, rival warbands battled for scrap and minor battles erupted over salvage rights. This rivalry maintained exactly the appropriate level of tension to keep the Orcs from becoming bored. Iron decking was repurposed into battlewagons, plated up stompas, and pounded into rough body armor to outfit knobs. Several warbands were swept into the warp as they overstretched their limits and hacked away pieces of the Space Hulk's outermost fortifications in the desperate rush to grab metal. It was because of such folly that warp creatures were able to re-enter World Killer. Several more demon intrusions hampered the voyage, and Ghazghkull had to personally repel the worst of these warp assaults. There was an abundance of furious wog energy as fierce fights erupted over the Space Hulk, and the Orcs thrived and proliferated. The Voidcraft was soon bursting at the seams with more greenskins. Swarms of grots scurried everywhere, and the halls echoed with chants, shoot-a-blasts, and the directives of the ever-busy mechs. The joyous Orcs were beginning to feel restless as the demon tides ebbed. Unexpected jolts informed everybody that the lumbering Space Hulk was slowing down. World Killer slammed back into reality with a gut-wrenching thud. The gigantic Space Hulk had filled what had before been an empty emptiness. Klaxons blared throughout the vast vessel, and Ghazghkull's voice blasted from speakers and through corridors, warning everyone to prepare for fight. The force of World Killer slammed the Space Hulk forward like a tidal wave. It slammed through defense stations, sending scared picket ships scurrying to avoid the oncoming wall of space trash. The Orcs appeared at the fringe of a critical star system to the Imperium in 941 M41, aiming straight for the core planet. Armageddon, an industrial behemoth of mankind's domain, loomed large in front of them. In the Segmentum Solar, the planet was around 10,000 light-years to the galactic northeast of Terra. It was an important crossing point for navigational routes, and its innumerable manufactorums provided ammunition to Astra Militarum units all over the Armageddon sector and beyond. There was nothing in the galaxy that could stop World Killer from crashing into Armageddon. Ghazghkull, guided by his visions, did not want to stop flying. Instead, he embraced the headlong plummet towards the land below. As the hull flared with fire and the Hulk thundered down from Armageddon's sky like a scrap iron avalanche, he let forth joyful war yells. Ghazghkull had only made a reputation for himself up to this point on Uruk, a little-known and soon-to-be dead star system. His name, on the other hand, would soon send terror tremors across hundreds of thousands of worlds. Ghazghkull was now on the verge of achieving grandeur. Surrounding Imperial fleets, long-range missiles, and the planet's orbital defense lasers did everything they could to avoid the inevitable. They were able to split off a few sections of the impending space Hulk with their weapons, but they were unable to stop World Killer's final descent or modify its course. The huge space Hulk fell through Armageddon's filthy atmosphere, crashing landing on its largest continent, Armageddon Prime, despite being robbed of much of its mass by the desperate salvos. The landing's massive impact rocked the entire Earth, and its blast wave wreaked havoc. The sun was obscured by a cloud of trash. The landing's devastating impact instantly immolated hundreds of thousands of orcs. Their losses, on the other hand, were a small percentage of their total. As the shock wore off, a few orcs realized that they had all been killed in the massive accident. Although the force field projector absorbing the brunt of the hit undoubtedly helped, Ghazghkull said it was the god's protection. Regardless, the orcs screamed their delight at having survived the thrilling journey. They poured out of drop ramps or just blew new escape holes through the already torn and rent wrecks of the remaining hulls. Eager to vent their pent-up aggression, Ghazghkull split his followers into 5 hordes, each of which was led by one of his most formidable warlords. Ghazghkull had vanquished these leaders on Uruk, savage orcs who had learnt through battling with him. The towering Wavog Overlord pointed out the path each of his sub-commanders should walk in the midst of the dust storm's blackness. Ghazghkull released limitless columns of orc war vehicles and living seas of green-skinned infantry with a wave of his power claw. Countless millions screamed in unison. The defenders of Armageddon were unprepared for what was about to happen. The Astra Militarum and Armageddon's planetary defense forces were well equipped, but they were completely unprepared for the waves of violence that swept through their armies. The humans had clearly underestimated their adversaries' strategic capabilities. They'd faced orcs before, but these greenskins were different. This wasn't a routine attack from a petty warlord. This was Wavog, Ghazghkull. Despite the fact that none of his subordinates demonstrated the same level of daring and cunning as their master, Ghazghkull had drilled enough techniques into their heads for some of it to stick. They quickly defeated the legions of the Planetary Defense Force, which had advanced from the planet's hive cities to confine them. The orcs first launched assaults to pin their opponents to the flat ash wastes, while motorcycle mobs and battle wagon units rushed around to encircle and cut off their enemy supply lines. The noose was then tightened by the greenskins. They deployed their mech gun batteries to annihilate the frantic defenders trapped in the ever-shrinking cauldron. Gun lines met desperate attempts to break free. The orcs mowed down anything that moved mercilessly, guffawing at the lines of humies who advanced only to die, aping their dying curses as they twitched their final limbs onto the blood-stained ash. The orcs marched on the hive cities after clearing the plains, and they were stunned. The hives climbed up higher than mountains, built over enormous ash-blown desert wastelands. These were the Imperium's huge factory cities, the lifeblood of its never-ending war endeavors. This was industrial might on a scale the orcs had never seen before. The mechs were enthralled by the hives, envisioning how they could reuse them and what they could make with such massive quantities of material. The Imperium's hive defense proved to be more formidable. Every regiment available, as well as hastily armed people, were added to the Astra Militarum's ranks. Each massive walled fortress was surrounded by a maze of trenches and redoubts. Ghazghkull took one look at Hive Vulcanus before declaring it would be destroyed in 2 Sundays. Ghazghkull did not want to waste his strength, despite the fact that his troops were large enough to overwhelm the gates. He hadn't fully unleashed the terror of his gargant big mobs yet, but he believed that such massive firepower should be saved for when it was truly needed. Instead, his strategy to seize the massive industry city demonstrated his dexterity. It was simple. All that was required was faultless execution and seamless cooperation, which would be a hard request for most WoG exclamation leaders, but not for Ghazghkull. Blitz brigades, armored battle wagon wedges, were sent to attack the outer barriers. The first wave had rams, and it was their job to burst apart the outer walls by carrying them over the rubble with their tracks. The mobile infantry, predominantly Goth boys, with swarms of Burna boys among them, followed in the wake of the smoke-belching orc battle wagons. Scorches made up the third wave, and their mission was to drive through the gaps and clear any defenses with sweeping flame. As the battle wagons cleared the last trench, tractor beams would be directed at the gates. The laden wagons would be at peak speed, just as the doors were wrenched off their hinges if the timing was correct. A Stormboy's airdrop and stompas with wrecking balls opening up holes at critical spots were secondary ideas. When the infantry waves were eventually freed, they could freely enter Vulcanus. The strategy worked so well that it was nearly too good. If it hadn't been for the hive's tenacity, it would have been destroyed in a single solar day. Desperate humans resorted to all manner of traps and ambushes within the tight confines of the hive's underways. Despite their valor, tens of thousands of orcs swarmed Hive Vulcanus, slaughtering or enslaving its inhabitants. Following the capture of Hive Vulcanus, the surviving hives of Armageddon Prime quickly followed. Human refugee columns extended all the way to the horizon. Ghazghkull's huge metal heel covered all of Armageddon Prime. What were previously manufactories have been transformed into orc-infested workshops. Slaves were forced to work until they died, robbing their towns of whatever resource the mechs could use to power the greenskin war machine. The WoG headed south, reaching Armageddon Secundus, a densely inhabited continent. The strategy worked so well that it was nearly too good. If it hadn't been for an enemy forever. Commissar Yerrick is in charge of Hades Hive's defense. Due to their softness, Humies have a difficult time gaining respect from orcs, especially greenskins, led by a stoic and battle-hungry Goth like Ghazghkull. Although the orcs admired Space Marines for their combat abilities, none more so than Commander Dante of the Blood Angels, it was an Imperial commissar that earned the most attention. Here was a ruthless warrior who was just as willing to shoot his own men as the enemy if it meant victory. Commissar Sebastian Yerrick was clearly a thorn in Ghazghkull's side, as the Greenskins believe it was only he who could have kept the defenders of Hades Hive alive for so long. The orcs gradually discovered from their captives that the Hades defenders feared Yerrick as much as they feared Ghazghkull's wrath. This was the kind of leader the orcs could look up to. The fact that he was dressed in Goth colors, black with red trim, only added to his already high self-esteem. Yerrick is claimed to be the only one of Ghazghkull's opponents that he ever cursed, which is great praise indeed. Those orcs that encountered the fabled Yumi boss frequently expressed dissatisfaction. Yerrick was only human-sized in person, albeit this was mitigated by the fact that he wore an orc power claw and had an evil eye. It was believed among the boys that those orcs who recognized who they were up against were invariably slaughtered, because they stood gape-jawed in bewilderment at Yerrick's insulting puniness, and therefore exposed themselves to a death blow. Even if it was a cunning, stealthy blood axe ploy, the wily orcs recognized the advantages of this strategy. Season of the Darkness. Ghazghkull leads his greenskins against the Armageddon Steel Legion's troops. The stormy skies were perpetually crimson, hued as Armageddon's season of shadows set in, the cyclical time when the planet's volcanic mountains erupted. This was yet another omen of the orcs' approaching conquest. The orcs had to cross an expanse of equatorial jungle, considered impenetrable by mankind to reach to Armageddon Secundus. The fetid swamp region was a maze of mudpits populated with vicious wild creatures that could sink armies at a time. The greenskins relished the opportunity to destroy the flora and fauna, while the mechs built pontoon bridges or projected force fields across the sinking bogs. The orc hordes pushed through Imperial troops quicker than they could march, thanks to their tenacity and improvised creativity. Infantry, armored columns, stompa mobs, and towering gargants marched across the rickety bridges and emerged on the other side of the forests. The orcs once again caught the humans off guard and demolished their defensive fortifications. As the orcs sped through the ash, these iron-plated tank killers marched through the shellstorm, clanking onward. The enemy armor formations were smashed by a land armada of deft dreads, killicans, and monstrous morganauts. As power claws ripped turrets off, explosions erupted over the plains. The moans of the eviscerated victims were music to the orcs' ears as buzzsaw arms stretched in to savage the exposed crew. The Stompas and Deft Dreads used their firepower to swing the scales in the evenly matched combat between the Gargants and the Titans, reducing the adversaries' tanks to smoking rubble. The destroyed Imperial Titans sent up towering mushroom clouds, and the concussive explosions of their detonations killed a lot of orcs. But after the shockwaves died down, the green tide surged across the massive craters. The most heinous of sieges. The Armageddon War reached a new level of cruelty as a result of the sieges that followed. The humans' resistance hardened as they realized what was in store for them. After the Blood Axes formed a bargain with its corrupt governor, the orcs stormed Infernus Hive, but they were unable to break through the huge hive cities of Hades and Hellsreach. In a last-ditch effort, the Imperials used virus bombs, a terrible and forbidden technology from their ancient past. Hundreds of thousands of orcs were killed, but they persisted in assaulting the hive cities for little gain. Ghazghkull was compelled to direct the assaults himself because his sub-commanders were stumped as to how to break through. Ghazghkull used a variety of tactics, including lightning assaults, feints, massive wave attacks, and massed bombardments. Storm boys plummeted from the sky attacked, while the most cunning commandos invaded the sewage tunnels. These stratagems paid off at Hellsreach, with each onslaught advancing deeper into the maritime hive metropolis. Ghazghkull's final strategy, gathering the Weird Boys together so their Wivog exclamation-addled minds blasted forth a mental storm, worked brilliantly in the midst of the bloodbath. The defenders were overpowered because they were paralyzed by madness. Each of Ghazghkull's movements was parried in Hades. The Storm Boys were shot down by anti-aircraft fire, while the commandos were engaged in a running battle with tunnel fighters, halting the underground advance. Human suicide teams took out Gargants after siege engines were disabled. Commissar Yarrick, who was destined to become the most respected Yumi that Wivog Ghazghkull had ever encountered, was in charge of defending Hades' Hive. A surprising counterstrike. The Salamanders chapter has arrived in Akron to confront the orcs. While Ghazghkull was concentrated on breaking Hades' Hive apart, another orc force under his command was preparing to overrun the hive city of Akron. That was, though, before the sky exploded. Craters were blown among the orc hordes by orbital bombardment. Thunderhawks peeled free of the cloud cover as they gaped aloft, the sound of their engines heard over the concussive boom of their bombing runs. The Imperial Space Marines, the Emperor's best warriors, had arrived. The Blood Angels, Ultramarines, and Salamanders assaulted, and the orcs experienced their first taste of overwhelming defeat. Ghazghkull could have united his army and drove off the Space Marine offensive if he had devoted his attention to the deteriorating situation at that time. Armageddon would have most likely fallen if he had done so. The conclusion of the siege of Hades' Hive, on the other hand, had become an obsession. Ghazghkull, prophet though he was, could no longer hear anything but the call to crush his iron boots on any who dared to challenge him in the red haze of war. The last blast door was finally broken down by Ghazghkull's own Bullaboys. Ghazghkull launched everything at the hive city now that the inner gates were open, unleashing his ultimate fury. The Space Marines arrived too late to save Hades' Hive, and the inhabitants were virtually all slaughtered. Ghazghkull sent the rest of his forces to besiege Tartarus' Hive, his numbers decimated and dispersed. The planet's fate was in jeopardy, but the Space Marines were fast to reposition. Even as Gorkanauts and Stompas smashed down the hive's gates, a drop-pod assault hit the orcs. When Ghazghkull came, the Greenskins had been driven back and were on the edge of breaking. When Ghazghkull and his bodyguard vanished, his counterattack was just getting started to reclaim the initiative. Rumors that their legendary war boss had been killed spread like wildfire among the orcs, who began to falter and break. The Imperium believed they had expelled the orcs from Armageddon as a result of this. That was not the case. Many fought their way into the ash wastelands and managed to flee, finally reaching the tropical jungles. Furthermore, Ghazghkull was not killed. Gork's hand is said to have reached down to free his chosen one. Ghazghkull's few orc detractors said he had fled, but the war boss retreated off-planet in any case. Orcs never lose in fight. We can always return for another go. A well-known orc proverb. Ghazghkull was not idle after leaving Armageddon. He didn't see the campaign as a setback, but rather as a necessary stumbling block on the way to a grander goal, because Gork and Mork had disclosed a master plan to Ghazghkull. The warlord could see now that Armageddon was simply the beginning, not the end. If the Imperium made one major error after the Second War for Armageddon, it was not pursuing Ghazghkull with all of their might and resources right away. Few listened to Yurik's advice to track him down, despite the fact that he was a battle-tested commissar. In reality, the Imperium's high command on Armageddon assumed that the orc warlord who had appeared out of nowhere to devastate their planet was either dead or would be a washed-up nothing if he had survived the war. He might be able to live as a loner for a while, but if he tried to rally additional orcs around him, he would almost certainly be slaughtered as a failure. The opposite could not be further from the truth. Orcs frequently overthrow their failed commander after losing a great battle, the first step on the path to complete anarchy. Ghazghkull had to remind some tribes of his greatness early on after his escape by defeating his adversaries in a gruesome manner. The warlord, on the other hand, not only recovered his followers' full allegiance by his triumphant deeds of violence, but also through his words. The orc gods had revealed to Ghazghkull, or rather, Ghazghkull claimed the orc gods had revealed to him, that in order to annihilate your foe, you must first know him. Such a notion was both radical and deep to the orcs. This indicated that the Armageddon invasion was nothing more than a test run for Ghazghkull, an experiment to see how the Imperium would react to a huge invasion. To an orc from the isolated world of Urk, the rapid Space Marine strikes and the grinding attrition of the human fighters had been eye-openers. Ghazghkull had learned everything he needed to know about the Imperium's tactics at this point. It was time to reorganize, to recruit fresh soldiers, to rebuild and repair the Wavog, until it was capable of posing a threat to entire solar systems. Onward and upward to Golgotha. On Armageddon, the majority of Ghazghkull's forces were left behind. When Ghazghkull landed in the heart of notorious orc territory, the world of Golgotha, he had only a few of his most trusted minions with him. The Golgotha subsector had been largely colonized by mankind in the past, although it has since passed through the hands of several races until being overrun by the orcs. That Wavog, on the other hand, had lost steam long ago, leaving behind a slew of diverse and fighting tribes. Ghazghkull began subjugating the Greenskins in the same way he did on Urk. He started off by clubbing bosses and gaining new mobs one by one. But when orcs get enthusiastic, word spreads quickly. Whether it was the incredible power of his adamantium skull headbutts or the orcish wisdom he received from Gork and Mork's visions, whole tribes were soon seeking out this new warlord. During this period, Commissar Yurik was relentless in his pursuit of the renegade orc warlord. Ghazghkull declared that as Gork and Mork's chosen one, he was the only one capable of defeating the Yumi with the evil eye. Unlike his subordinates, Ghazghkull understood that attempting to stop the pursuing humans would be futile. Like an orc Wavog, a human crusade thrived on conflict and victory, and needed to be exhausted first. Ghazghkull accomplished this by ostensibly fleeing and remaining just out of reach of his pursuers, sacrificing to Uruk any of his subordinates who disobeyed or challenged him. He did this for 10 years until he was able to set his trap on his pursuers. He blinded the exhausted and overstretched human commanders with the promise of victory over his seemingly depleted orc forces by luring them to the planet of Golgotha. A large space hulk had deposited a second, smaller Wog on Golgotha, which was waiting in large underground cave complexes, unknown to the Imperium. Ghazghkull built a base to give the Imperial attackers the impression he was planning a last stand, to force the humans to commit fully to the field against him on Golgotha. The Orc warlord went so far as to sacrifice his remaining Gargants in a pointless flanking maneuver. Once they did, Ghazghkull caught them between the anvil of his base and the hammer of his hidden Gringskin troops, while his space hulk drove off the Imperial Navy forces orbiting the world. Ghazghkull wanted to confront Uruk personally, but when he saw the elderly commissar making a last stand at the wreckage of his Baneblade, which had purposefully rammed one of the Gargants, he saw an opportunity to show his dominance over the other Greenskins, so he ordered the human captured instead. Ghazghkull wanted to use Uruk to show that he was superior to the other orcs and that he knew how humans worked. Uruk was first thrown down the garbage chute of his space hulk, with the promise that the human would survive. The other orcs were skeptical because no one had ever survived the ordeal before, but Uruk would reappear a few solar days later. Ghazghkull then threw Uruk in with the rest of the Imperial detainees, predicting that the human would find a way to kill them all. True to form, Uruk instigated a revolt and made his way to the Space Hulk's bridge, where he attempted to initiate the vessel's self-destruction by simultaneously activating all of the vessel's propulsion systems. He came close to succeeding in this endeavor before the orcs intervened. The other orcs were convinced that Ghazghkull could predict the humans' behavior this time, so Ghazghkull ordered Mad Doc Grotznik to return the humans' bionics to him. Ghazghkull then had Uruk escorted by his boys to an intact shuttlecraft, where he told the human to prepare for the orcs' return to Armageddon and to leave the space hulk. Ghazghkull's position as warlord of his massive Wavog was solidified by this casual display of dominance. Thus began a decades-long process of reconstruction. Ghazghkull carefully balanced his army's growing numbers and exponential Wavog energy with the need to maintain a low profile for the time being. He had been advised by Gork and Mork not to draw too much attention to himself just yet. It was the first time a Wavog exclamation leader attempted to limit the number of orcs he attracted, but it was all part of the plan. Ghazghkull would need more than just an enormous army to take the next step toward ultimate victory. He'd need his new tactics perfected and his new weapons to function properly. He understood that if his power grew too quickly, the plan would not be ready. Ghazghkull, on the other hand, launched raids throughout the Ultima Segmentum and beyond. Some were small, involving only a few mobs, while others were massive assaults capable of taking down an entire planet. The attacks targeted Imperial outposts or disrupted shipping lanes. The orcs also invaded Tau space to annihilate colonies and attacked other orc territories. Ghazghkull led some expeditions and put a new corps of sub-commanders to the test on others. The raids were carried out to train new leaders and test his latest strategies, rather than for the sake of plunder or even winning battles. Teleporta Technology is a technology company based in Teleporta. Ghazghkull joins forces with Nasdraga Girdgrub, the infamous Bad Moon's war boss. The number of recorded attacks Ghazghkull, or troops carrying his symbol, had made would have terrified the Imperium if they had collected and analyzed their dispersed data files. There was an expanding trend of violence from 945 to 996.M41, with tens of thousands of raids. The Imperium, on the other hand, was vast, bureaucratic, and besieged by more evident threats. Only Uruk, who had never given up on his foe, continued to warn of any approaching Wog. Directed by Ghazghkull. In the year 997.M41, Ghazghkull formed an alliance with Nasdraga Girdgrub, the most famed Bad Moon warlord in millennia. The two commanders put their new teleporter technology to the test, which allows them to drop swarms of boys, vehicles, and eventually even the towering gargants from a faraway space hull down onto a planet. On the imperial world of Pissanurkanfor, this was put to the test. Only the Dark Angels were able to prevent the planet from being overrun, yet victory was not Ghazghkull's true purpose. His preparations were finally complete, and he was ready to unleash his full power on the Imperium, carrying out a plot that had been in the works for 50 standard years. Armageddon's Third War. Humans are all trash who ought to be stomped on, is an orc saying. Except in the case of One-Eye Yerrick. He understands how to fight. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka is credited with this work. Warlord Orc during the Third War for Armageddon, Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka battles, Commissar Yerrick. Ghazghkull collected his armies and reconsidered his tactics during the 57 standard years, following the Second War for Armageddon. He was not keen to make the same error he had made at Hades' Hive on Armageddon over 5 decades before. Hades' Hive was supposed to be one of the first areas to fall. Armageddon's defenses were rebuilt after Ghazghkull's initial invasion nearly overwhelmed the planet due to its importance to the Imperium. Armageddon's surrounding star systems had been heavily protected. New naval stations and orbital defense platforms provided Armageddon with a level of security rivaled only by Terra and a few other Imperium worlds. This was insignificant in comparison to Ghazghkull's Wavog. Ghazghkull's junk-laden armada slammed into real space and advanced with a crushing inevitability. As they headed for Armageddon, they left shattered planets in their wake. Imperial task forces dispatched to intervene were devoured whole, never to be seen again. The distress call went out in a frenzy, requesting reinforcements before the orcs could reach Armageddon. Ghazghkull reappeared on the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, exactly 57 Terran years after his initial invasion. The orbital war above Armageddon raged for 2 hot nights, but the sky were filled with the vapor trails and incandescent afterblaze of orc dropships by the dawn of the 3rd solar day. Swarms of atmospheric fighter fighters and swooping bomber jets swooped down behind them in a thundering wave. Ghazghkull chose not to fight at Hades' Hive, the invincible high point where his last invasion failed. There would be no such disobedience this time. Giant asteroids aimed by orbiting space hulks broke the entire hive apart, annihilating its occupants and defenses in a horrible act of revenge. This was only the beginning of the carnage to come. Ground-based defense lasers and missile systems wreaked havoc on the orcs, crisscrossing energy beams and flowering explosions, filling the sulfur-yellow skies. Nonetheless, the greenskins were arriving in such large numbers that massive armies were already forming in the ash wastelands. Feral orcs and commando teams poured into the masses from Armageddon's tropical jungles and mountain ranges. Many macrocannons and defense lasers were wrested from their former owners thanks to quick-hitting strikes by ground troops. Other orcs worked to build landing strips, making it easier for Dakajets and Blitz-bombers to refuel and rejoin the fight. The orcs gradually gained control of the dogfights taking place above them, and they soon commanded the skies. The Imperial forces were subjected to brutal shelling and strafing runs wherever they collected to form a defensive line. The orcs were gaining the upper hand everywhere thanks to their surging spearheads and unfettered fury in their attacks. However, many Space Marine chapters began to arrive at that point in the combat. Their rapid assaults threatened to derail the Greenskin march once more. Ghazghkull had anticipated this and had prepared his own defenses. The first Hive metropolis fell to betrayal rather than battle, as Akron was conquered by treachery from within. Ghazghkull signaled for his next surprise to aid the conflicts raging over the ash wastelands. Space hulks and asteroid fortresses in orbit high above Armageddon released portions of themselves. Plummeting to Armageddon, the orc rocks were unleashed. Rocks, Ghazghkull's latest secret weapon, is unleashed. During his first invasion, Ghazghkull's forces were thwarted by Space Marines' quick strikes. Despite the greenskin army's superior mobility, they couldn't match the Adeptus Astartes' quick-hitting ability. Worse, before Ghazghkull could respond, the stalled greenskin advances turned into routes. All of it changed when the rocks arrived. Orc rocks are asteroid hunks that have been hollowed out and filled with troops, as well as rudimentary engines and weapons. Their blazing track is slowed by massive force fields, retro rockets, and upgraded tractor cannons as they descend from orbit. The rocks landed on Armageddon in the green tropical rainforests and across all of Armageddon's continents, not just on the inhabited Primus and Secundus landmasses. Some rocks were destroyed by ground fire or by their own impact, but many more were saved. They not only slammed into the globe, crushing everything underneath, but the shockwaves from their landings were also destructive. The Space Marines discovered the rocks crashing among them as they began their attack runs to halt the Orcs' onslaught. For the Orcs, each landed rock became a bastion, a rallying point, and a ready-made castle. The rocks also had teleporter arrays, which were originally utilized by Ghazghkull in his Pisana campaign, in addition to firearms. These were quickly utilized to deliver Orc reinforcements to the planet in order to repel the attacks of the Space Marines. Special Marine killer mobs, Stompas, artillery, and even Gargants were among them, creating new routes. A member of the Cult of Speed and an evil Sun's Orc. Despite an increasing number of Space Marine counterattacks hitting deep into Orc battlefronts, the rocks and transported reinforcements put the Imperium back on its heels once more. Ghazghkull did not back down. In fact, he exploited his advantage. It was the ideal time to unleash another destruction strategy from his long-prepared arsenal. It was time to unleash the Speed Freaks. Orc cults of speed have existed for as long as Orcs have existed. These speed-crazed warriors are very mobile, with each trooper riding a warbike, warbuggy, or truck. While every clan has its share of speed-crazed orcs, the evil Suns have the most of them. All speed freaks are swift, impetuous, and prone to charge at the earliest opportunity by nature. Only Ghazghkull's dominating presence, a no-nonsense Goth, stood a chance of controlling such rambunctious soldiers as well as he did. The speed freaks were held in reserve per Ghazghkull's orders. It was practically fatal for them not to be first in battle, but instead to sit and wait, revving their engines. Patience is not a virtue that speed freaks possess. Ghazghkull, on the other hand, had been persistent in proving his case, making it with his adamantium-plated head by reducing Evil Sun's warlord Gurpag and his custom bike into a bloody scrap heap of broken bits. It had been a compelling case. The speed freaks were only let loose after the special teleporter mobs had punched holes in the enemy lines. In the Ash Wastes, Annihilation, Ghazghkull sends out the Orc speed freaks to wreak havoc on Armageddon. The speed freaks sped off in vast columns, able to exploit even the tiniest openings between battle lines. The warbikers blazed away with their weaponry where they needed to expand the route, unleashing a hail of bullets that slashed Imperial Guardsmen in vast arcs of red wreckage. Speed freaks are infamous for sacrificing armor for speed, but their bikes and like vehicles, in true Orc tradition, never skimp on firepower, carrying more armament than any reasonable creature would expect on such light frames. Throughout Armageddon Prime and Secundus, roving bands of speed freaks tore through the Ash Desert's vast plains. Each war horde of speed freaks was made up of dozens of smaller warbands with names like the Red Wheels, Burning Death, and Slashers. The toxic outflow of the Gargant big mobs, which spewed exhaust fumes visible from orbit, was matched by the clouds of dust they churned up as they sped across the barrens. Few Imperial officers had the time, or the tactical aptitude, to consider the broader picture, as they were focused on the numerous conflicts fought throughout the vast continents. Most people would have dismissed the Orcs' attack as anarchic chaos, rather than a well-planned battlefront, referring to the scores of assaults scattered across the immense globe. They were completely wrong. Ghazghkull was in charge of the battles on Armageddon, and it was his tactical brilliance that devised the lethal combination that was winning the conflict. The scattered rock landing sites had acted as strong points for Orc troops to concentrate, as well as bases for the teleporters to lock and beam down a continual flow of reinforcements. The Imperium had no choice but to focus their attacks on these locations, leaving them vulnerable to the Speed Freaks' lightning attacks. Few Imperial officers had the time or the tactical aptitude to consider the broader picture, as they were focused on the numerous conflicts fought throughout the vast continents. Most people would have dismissed the Orcs, even as the Imperium's armies proceeded to eradicate the Rock's danger. They found themselves being pursued. In the broad plains, fast and hard-hitting Speed Freak columns caused havoc on Imperial forces, darting in and out of various formations and launching daring hit and run attacks. The legendary leader of the Burning Death Speed Freaks, Zagbos Skargrim, encircled and slaughtered entire battalions of Imperial Guardsmen. The trapped humans were forced into big groups, setting up mass scorcher runs that lit up the night skies. The Burning Death were famed for their love of fire, and the trapped humans were pushed into huge numbers, setting up mass scorcher runs that lighted up the night skies. Air wings of Dakajet and Burna bomber squadrons strewn above the ash wastes operated as mobile artillery for the Speed Freaks. The air and ground forces engaged in a violent combat, with each side attempting to kill their target before the other could enter the fight. Many friendly fire instances were not unintentional, but rather the deliberate outcome of enraged rivals arriving on the scene to find their opponents already dead. Hives are being attacked. Orc rocks had mysteriously landed in the fire wastes and deadlands to the north and south of Armageddon's main landmass. These desolate areas had been thought to be inhospitable, but their worth was revealed several weeks later when hundreds of tanker-sized Orc submersibles rose from the contaminated seas and landed at Hive's Tempestora and Hellsreach. Tempestora fell within solar days of the Orcs overrunning the other half of the Hive, despite Hive Gang militia holding out long enough at Hellsreach for Tempestus Scions and Space Marines to arrive, preventing the Orcs from overrunning the other side. Tartarus Hive repelled its greenskin assault despite being besieged and shelled. Yet the victory was hollow. Deathskull scrap mobs ripped apart the Hive's huge factories for scrap, destroying the Hive. Katana Bay, a key water processing station just south of the plains of Anthrand, was the location of a skirmish that evolved into the campaign's greatest dreadnought conflict. Large vehicles couldn't get through the network of pipes that made up the vast refinery, and with no armor to stand against them, the dread mobs were an unstoppable force, able to fire down or smash down any human soldiers who dared to defend those tortuous passages. The advent of Space Marine dreadnoughts from 5 distinct chapters was the only thing that stopped the Orcs. Tankfestas and Space Marine Devastators moved into the tangle of pipelines, seeking to tip the battlefield's balance. Although the Orcs were eventually forced to retreat, the Greenskins' devastation to the facility was irreversible, shutting off water to much of Armageddon Prime. A never-ending battle of attrition. Ghazghkull's Mag causes immeasurable destruction in Armageddon's swarm cities. It was getting difficult to comprehend the scale of the escalating Armageddon battle. Billions of lives had been sacrificed in the never-ending struggle, and the entire world had become a symbol of immense destruction and war. It was a site where the galaxy's most powerful war machines clashed and heroes died in droves. The vibrations of the Mag were felt by Orcs. All around the galaxy, the most aggressive greenskins were drawn to Armageddon like moths to a flame, seeking fame and glory. The Third War for Armageddon, however, had expanded beyond the planet, with Orc raiders prevalent throughout the subsector. Those worlds that had been rendered susceptible by the Imperial commitment to the Armageddon War were now set ablaze. The Ragnarok, the Great Mag, as Ghazghkull had dubbed it, was rumored to be the final apocalyptic conflict in which the Orcs would prove their worth before their savage and primitive gods. The Imperium had been driven into a total war mode to combat the Orcs, feeding the meat grinder with the equivalent of entire planetary populations worth of troops. Around Armageddon, a 1,000 light-year recruitment zone was established. Every Imperial world in that region had their tithe of Imperial Guard battalions increased, and their industry was devoted entirely to the development of armaments. Even the Imperial logisticians, who numbered in the thousands, could only guess how many Imperial Guard had participated in the Armageddon defense, less alone track the wealth of other troops. This featured elements from at least 25 different Adeptus Astartes chapters, multiple Adeptus Sororitas orders, and 6 Titan legions. According to the most recent tally, a total of 17 Imperial Navy fleets were stationed in the Armageddon sector. Worse, such data were at least a Terran year out of date, during which time the war had only become worse. The Imperium had always feared the coming together of so many Orc tribes, and now its worst fears were being realized. The wisest of the Imperial leaders had already come to the terrible realization that Armageddon's industry was likely to be wrecked beyond repair. The war was no longer about defending Armageddon, but rather about protecting its subsector, and most importantly, keeping the ever-increasing tide of Orcs at bay. If the huge green threat on Armageddon could not be managed, it would spread outwards and threaten the Imperium's heartland, Holy Terra. Although it was difficult for him to leave the largest battle he had ever witnessed, Ghazghkull knew he needed to get back to work. A stronger and louder call. The most fearsome Orc warlord could only be dragged away from the war raging across Armageddon by the pull of fate. Ghazghkull knew it was time to move on as the great green sights began to overwhelm him. That fight had become self-sustaining, and he was required to spread the ripples of Wavog energy until the galaxy was covered in blood. Ghazghkull could feel the pressure growing behind his adamantium plate as he waded through shellbursts and claimed space marine helmets for his trophy rack. He was about to experience another vision, and based on the ache in his skull, it was going to be a major one. It was impossible to fight. Ghazghkull returned to kill Rekka, his orbiting ship, and finally gave in to the green flashes that had been occupying his patchwork mind. Gork and Mork's voices had never sounded so shrill, and Ghazghkull's head was still ringing with them. Ghazghkull could not clear his thoughts or grasp what the gods' guttural whispers were saying to him, no matter how many times he repositioned his thinking parts against the ship's bulwark. The visions were excruciatingly painful, and his right eye bulged as he screamed in pain. A decent scrap like Armageddon would be considered a victory in and of itself by any other Orc, but they lacked ambition. Ghazghkull, who had been given his conqueror's visions, had no idea what he was seeking for and just knew that it would not be found on Armageddon. He ordered a few of Voidcraft from the fleet that still surrounded Armageddon like vultures to assemble over Kill Rekka, trusting that the voices would become clear in time. Ghazghkull departed the battle for Armageddon confident that his selected lieutenants would take leadership in his absence, as he had instructed. The greatest Orc warlord of his period glanced back at the fast-dwindling sphere of Armageddon, and his only regret was that he doubted he'd be back before his henchmen captured the entire world in his honor. Ghazghkull moved away from the gateway and peered around the bridge as the fleet gained speed. A herd of Weirboy warfeds had been gathered under his command. He hoped that the insane Orc mystics could help him with his visions in the same way that their peculiar abilities seemed to help direct the best course once a space Hulk entered the warp. The Weirboys, on the other hand, had only served to anger Ghazghkull thus far. The towering warlord stood on the bridge, watching the drooling warfeds crash into each other like boys in a fungal beer stupor. Ghazghkull was irritated by such shenanigans because the old Goth in him addressed problems or uncertainties with a simple punch to the face. Ghazghkull was unaware, however, that his exit from Armageddon was not unnoticed. Evasion and pursuit. The Orc flotilla departing the system was spotted by Imperial auger stations, and the vessel known as Kill Rekka, Ghazghkull's preferred capital ship, was identified. The Armageddon High Command was contacted, and the pursuit began within solar days. One fleet was led by Commissar Yerrick, while the other was led by High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars. They had previously allowed Ghazghkull to flee, and it had cost them dearly. Yerrick promised that they would not make the same mistake again. The speedier, more efficient Imperial vessels converged on the Orc fleet several solar weeks after departing Armageddon, using a pincer approach. Ghazghkull realized he couldn't escape his adversaries in the arid expanse known as the Haunted Gulf, where he was outmanned. With nowhere to hide, he ordered the fleet to head straight for their adversaries. The Orc fleet might still be able to blow a passage to freedom with the force of their broadsides. Despite Yarrick's warning that such a desperate maneuver was not only feasible, but likely, the Imperium's forces were taken aback by the unconventional move. The Orc ruse crippled several battle cruisers, turning them into drifting hulks. The scrap fleet, on the other hand, was ripped apart by the return fire, which destroyed Orc void ships one by one. Kill Rekka was left with a terrible list and a messed-up steering system. Kill Rekka was engulfed in a blaze of green energy as Yarrick and Helbrecht prepared to enter the Orc warship in order to personally assure Ghazghkull's demise. The lance strikes that pierced the lower decks of the Great Green beyond Kill Rekka swayed the ship back and forth. The explosions that followed blasted concussive forces throughout the ship, causing the entire Voidcraft to lurch violently and scattering everyone on the command deck. With a clatter, Ghazghkull tumbled over, his adamantium-clad head denting the steel deck plates. He screamed instructions and pushed out of the mass of weirboys that had shifted on top of him. Ghazghkull was possessed by an overwhelming force at that point, his head still ringing from the impact. Green lightning erupted in an arcing crown, bathing everyone in a weird green glow. The warfeds were set off by the rapid eruption of energy, which caused them to convulse in repetitive spasms that rose in intensity. The insane Orc psychers howled as their skin sizzled and raw power broke forth from their eyes and flowed forth from their teeth, engulfed in green flames. The warfeds yelled as one in thunderous voices, the same awful roar of Gork and Mork that Ghazghkull had been hearing. Finally, he realized what he needed to do. The god's voice commanded Ghazghkull to unify the Orcs and make the Great Wavag reverberate throughout the galaxy. The mighty voice spoke again, warning that only everlasting combat would bring Gork and Mork to life in the final Ragnarok. The warfeds detonated in a massive outpouring of energy after completing their mission of delivering the message, bathing everyone on the command deck in wet viscera and glowing green energy. This burst of green power surged outwards like a tidal wave, slamming into the enemy fleet. Yarrick and Helbrecht could only watch in dismay as Kill Rekka blinked once and vanished, their ship's systems trapped by mysterious energies. A trail of wreckage floating where the ship had once been was the sole proof that it had ever been there. Yarrick sagged, knowing that Ghazghkull's escape would spell disaster for the cosmos. Kill Rekka, a path of conquest character, was blasted into the warp, its path and destination unknown. Every greenskin on board suffered a tense ride during which the echoes of that great voice rang in their ears. No one knew how far they had traveled or where they had spun. Then they came to a standstill, reappearing in real space with the sensation of being punched in the gut. The Orcs staggered to the portholes, gasping in awe as they gazed out. They were surrounded by void ships of all sizes, but the make of such basic, rust bucket-like craft could not be misunderstood. Kill Rekka had appeared in the exact center of an Orc fleet. Kill Rekka had been an imposing vessel not long ago, with overlapping slabs of iron plate, protecting its hulls and turrets, gun decks, and all kind of armament. Internal explosions had done the rest after the Imperial fleet had ripped a number of holes through the Voidcraft's belly. Ghazghkull's mechs swarmed the ship, fixing holes in the inner hull and repairing the pipes that leaked fumes into the corridors. Kill Rekka was most likely mistook for space debris by the Orcs under Warlord Urgok Slayer, whose fleet they had appeared amidst, believing that some scrap-mongering death skulls or salvage-crazed mechs were merely breaking up pieces of old wreckage. Ghazghkull was less concerned about the hull repairs on board, instead instructing his mechs to repair the damaged teleporter. The Prophet of Gork and Mork prepared his boarding party as they worked on their tasks. It was easy to spot the largest Orc because a huge space hulk stood just above them in the fleet's center. That ship had received so much attention that it now resembled an orc stronghold hovering in space. Ghazghkull relied on luck and teleported blind, knowing that his edge was surprise. Ghazghkull and a mob of his baddest knobs, his bullaboys, emerged in a green flash in Warlord Urgok's command room, as if directed by the enormous green hands of Gork and Mork themselves. The action was quick and bloody, and the deck was quickly covered in the mangled bodies of the killed. Most of Urgok's bodyguard were killed before they could recover from their horror, and Ghazghkull had dragged Urgok from his throne and beaten him unconscious. As a result, a new Wavog began. The new fleet of Ghazghkull. Urgok's fleet was already large when Ghazghkull came, but it exploded when the prophet of Gork and Mork seized command. It was an anarchic tangle, as were all orc constructions. The majority of the void ships were constructed entirely of discarded flotsam, scavenged from the far reaches of the galaxy. Some had been salvaged and upgraded by the orcs. They came from all throughout the galaxy, some from faraway eras, after being discovered adrift in the warp. Even ships in the same squadron of the same class were rarely similar, as each had undergone numerous impromptu constructions and refits, each using whatever scrap could be available. It was also not the greenskin approach to fix things rather than patch them up. And no mech was ever quite content, always thinking he could improve things by adding another gun deck, missile silo, torpedo tube, or other shooty whatnots here and there. A pair of heavy Proud Hammer battlecruisers stood keel to keel with Imperial battleships and emerged victorious within that motley armada. The larger Voidcraft was rounded out by a half-dozen kill cruisers and terror ships. Before them came a swarm of smaller ships, some of which were little more than rust buckets with thrusters, yet they were deadly despite their battered and rusted exterior. Urgok's Space Hulk was the pride of the fleet, a monster of a starship with enough firepower to virtually match an entire Imperial battle fleet. Constructing a new Wavog, Warlord Urgok's empire had grown so big that Ghazghkull had to work his way through it in solar weeks. Most voluntarily joined the prophets of Gork and Mork, but a few obstinate cases needed to be given a few messed up instances before they realized the value of associating themselves with Ghazghkull. Urgok Da Slayer became a leader within Ghazghkull's throng after regaining consciousness, which made recruiting the rest of his army simpler. Many more orcs were required if the galaxy was to be set fire with Wavog energy. Orcs are a common race that can be found all over the cosmos. To search for every greenskin-held area, to travel to the many places where greenskins collected in overwhelming numbers, countless moons, planets, asteroid fields, or space hulks drifting in the gap between the stars, would take 1,000,000 lifetimes. As Ghazghkull knew, such travel was unnecessary because the might of the Wavog had summoned all orcs. Urgok's wars had been attracting a continuous stream of greenskins, new recruits drawn by the prospect of combat, space travel, and bigger fights. This rivulet became a cascading rain under Ghazghkull, as rivers of greenskins hurried to join the fleet. They needed something to do now. Ghazghkull guided the fleet into Orkland, where frenzied orc hordes were ready for fight. The fragments of his Wavog exclamation-tuned brain had sensed distant ripples of green energy coming from Octarius. Ghazghkull had heard rumors about a new ruler in that realm, and he was determined to claim the title Overfiend of Octarius for himself. When he arrived, though, he discovered something even better: War of the Octarians. Octarius besieged orcs fight a desperate battle against the Tyranids. For thousands of standard years, Octarius had been orc territory. It wasn't as backwater as Urk's subsector, and every now and then, a leader would rise up, yell Wavog, and lead an invasion to damage some section of the cosmos. Indeed, Ghazghkull Mag had rushed off to join Ghazghkull in the Golgotha sector, and was now commanding a massive army of orcs on Armageddon, holding his own in the Deadlands. Since Ghazghkull's departure, a new leader, a Death Skull warlord named Zog Steeltooth, has emerged to fill the power vacuum and assume the title of Overfiend of Octarius. Despite his liberal employment of blue war paint, Zog's Steeltooth's reign had not been a happy one. Tyranids had resurfaced, marching into Orc territory and devouring entire planets as they went. The Octarian War raged across the sector, with its epicenter squarely aimed at Octaria, the Greenskin territory's primary world. Both sides poured their force into the entire megacontinent of Octaria, which was turned into a battlefield. The Orcs of the Overfiend, who had grown fat and strong on a continual diet of violence, had found their match. Hive Fleet Leviathan's ever-evolving spawn were gaining the upper hand, showering the planet with reinforcements and sending still more broods of killing animals into the never-ending battle. Orcs were forced to take sanctuary in scrap iron fortifications all around Octaria. The Tyranids appeared to be on the verge of destroying each of the jury-rigged fortifications. Then, oh my goodness, Wavog! From the spore-infested heavens, Ghazghkull plummeted. The Overfiend's Orcs initially mistook the rocks bursting through the atmosphere for a new opponent. They fell all throughout Octaria, ripping enormous holes in the gargoyle-infested skies and plowing into the scuttling masses on the ground. However, it was more Orcs who emerged from the asteroids, not slime-covered, chitin-plated Tyranids. They pushed outside, carrying the fight to the Tyranids, while the rocks retaliated with powerful artillery. Behind their shoddy defenses, the Greenskins let forth volleys of cheers and a storm of support fire of their own. Then came the thunderous, earth-shaking footsteps of massive animals approaching. The approach of these invaders has been observed by the hive mind. The Tyranid retaliation was startlingly rapid. Larger swarms of animals, including enormous scythe-limbed freaks and gargant-sized beasts, lumbered into battle against the new greenskin danger from the skies. Octaria's Orcs' boisterous chanting choked them up, because they knew these colossal behemoths had been kept in reserve for the final death strike. These monsters would have appeared once the Orcs' defenses had been breached. Now the newcomers would be shredded, because infantry in the open would be doomed. The air glittered as teleporters began to bring in additional forces, much to their amazement. The cratered rock landing sites burned with weird lights all over Octaria. More and more mobs came with each flash, and these were not only infantry. Gorkanauts and Stompas arrived with guns blazing, concentrating their firepower on the larger adversaries, while Burna Boy's mobs spread out at their feet. They sent blooms of red fire flying out of their weapons with each blast, flash frying the lesser animals in droves. Countless crude banners and totems could be seen among the masses, hoisted high by the newly arrived troops or mounted atop clanking battle wagons. Octaria's Orcs recognized the emblems and knew who had arrived. Ghazghkull Thraka came via teleporta in Gargates, the Overfiend's shanty capital. As his bullaboys smashed through the serpentine Ravnas, who were beginning to collapse the first lines of defense, he led the attack. This enormous warlord in mega armor battled like Gork himself, according to the Greenskins who observed. In the midst of the chaos, he weaved in and out of view, yet he was simple to spot. He seemed to be surrounded by a green aura of ferocity, and he clobbered each of his opponents so hard that limbs, skulls, and claws flew in gory arcs all around him. He moved like a one-orc wave of destruction, like some elemental destructive power. Ghazghkull's power claw split many adversaries in two with each swipe of his custom shuta. Every movement he made, from his elbow backswing to his iron-shod feet stomping, split the Tyranids' shell-like armor and caused more to fall, flailing their dying throes on the blood-strewn ground. Then the unthinkable occurred. At Ghazghkull's feet, the body-strewn terrain buckled and bulged upwards. Ghazghkull thereafter vanished. A Moloch had appeared. It erupted from below, and the beast curled around itself like some awful constricting serpent as its bulk pierced the surface. This was the deadliest spawn of its type that had ever slithered underground or been seen by the light of any sun, according to any of the assembled Orcs. The triumphant screech from the beast's gaping maw bent metal and caused Orcs thousands of miles away to collapse and shield their ears. Something had gone wrong even before the victory shriek was finished. The Moloch shook, its mass flopping around as if the world itself was trembling. The beast then quivered, convulsing and twisting its massive coils into arcing loops. A power claw emerged from an odd protrusion in its belly, amidst geysers of gore and slime-covered entrails. Shoota blasts expanded the hole and Ghazghkull emerged, marching from the beast's belly. The mightiest of orc warlords screamed his victory into the heavens, a rallying call for greenskins and a challenge to all who lived. Nothing could stop the orcs after that. The greenskins of Wavog are chanting their warlord's name. Ghazghkull went on a killing spree, hacking, shooting, and slaying everything in sight. The orcs of Octaria surged forth from behind scrap iron fortifications to join in. Even Zog Steeltooth, Octaria's overfiend, was shouting the name Ghazghkull as he gunned down the Tyranids who tried to hold off the greenskin onslaught. The butchery began, and it continued until Octaria was free of the Leviathan's creatures. Another Armageddon is looming. Despite having little time to prepare, Ghazghkull made the most of it. Mechs fixed acid-eaten holes or welded iron-plated walls back into place. Others saw new cannons and anti-aircraft guns, indicating that the rocks were becoming more integrated into the entire defense. A few flashy enhancements, from teleporter pads to pulsar rockets, would give the interplanetary invaders something new to chew on under the watchful eye of the great big mech orcans. This battle appeared to be considerably bigger than the one on Armageddon. Ghazghkull looked up and bared his fang-like teeth in as close to a grin as he could muster as the heavens darkened and a massive, brooding shadow obscured the stars above. His Wavog had barely just begun. Additional greatness visions. The sights that had briefly filled Ghazghkull's medically healed brain have become more frequent since leaving Armageddon. Some of the spasms were so intense that they tipped the enormous orc over, forcing him to writhe in agony. Ghazghkull was gradually gaining control over other visions that were less invasive. They showed Ghazghkull glimpses of the action on Armageddon, such as Zagboss Skargrim tearing it up on his warbag or Commandant Clank leading his boys to victory. The sight of orcs marching in rows like human troops infuriated him, even in his dreams, but he couldn't disagree with the Blood Axe Warlord's fighting record. Ghazghkull knew he wasn't dreaming. He knew he was witnessing genuine happenings. Despite the great distance, Ghazghkull said that his voice carried and his subordinates heard his every shout when he issued commands or tactical advice during particularly riveting visions. This pleased him. He listened to the whispers in his thoughts, and his lieutenants were tortured as well. Ghazghkull's own voices were already advising him that once the combat on Octaria got underway, it was time to go. He was on his way to fulfill his destiny. He simply needed 3 or 4 more battle-racked regions to reach critical mass among the orcs. Ghazghkull was storming over the galaxy in his vision. His gigantic footprints were swaths of worlds ablaze with war, Armageddon, Octaria. He was already looking forward to the commencement of the next big struggle. After his death at the hands of Wolf Lord Ragnar Blackmane, Era Indomitus Ghazghkull Thraka was resurrected. Ghazghkull has fled the Octaria's war zone and is currently heading a fleet of nearly 5 million greenskin warships against the Imperium's soldiers since the Great Rift opened. The Wolf Lord Ragnar Blackmane of the Space Wolves chapter cut Ghazghkull's head during the Battle of Kronger. When a grot came across the fallen warlord's severed head, Mad Doc Grotznik conducted emergency surgery to reattach it to a new, even bigger greenskin body. Ghazghkull was reborn shortly after. Warlord of the Universe. When the Imperium of Mankind first encountered Ghazghkull, its leaders assumed he was just like all the other orc warlords that had come before him. He was bigger and stronger than most people, but not much more. They reluctantly conceded that Ghazghkull possessed more beast-like cunning than the other leaders of his terrible kind after multiple conflicts, but they still gave him little credence. Only a handful of Ghazghkull's human foes began to comprehend the scope of his ambitions, and it wasn't until the Third War for Armageddon that they realized he was an orc warlord unlike any they had before fought. Ghazghkull's foes who misjudge him only do so once. because they rarely survive encounter with the warlord. The few who survive talk of raw might and troops in the thousands, all driven by the same grand vision. Unlike other orcs, Ghazghkull has demonstrated a remarkable ability to learn from his mistakes, becoming stronger and more cunning with each battle. He's fine-tuned his tactics throughout time, inventing new plans based on his insights from prior conflicts. Even worse for his adversaries, Ghazghkull has evolved the ability to experiment, to try out new ideas in order to improve them. It's unclear whether the voices Ghazghkull hears in his thoughts are indeed Gork and Mork. What cannot be denied, however, is that the cunning orc appears to possess some sort of foresight. The orc warlord comes in exactly the right spot, at exactly the right time, time after time. Ghazghkull has shown to be the best tactician of his generation. He outmaneuvers his opponents, steamrolling over their assaults and avoiding their meticulously set traps as though anticipating them ahead of time. Ghazghkull has proven to be a superb organizer in his long wars, with well-planned attacks that surpass the Astra Militarum's precise battle plans. Ghazghkull, on the other hand, bears little resemblance to the hidebound tactician, as he is an innovator and a crafty opportunist, always ready to transfer his soldiers to exploit any unforeseen weakness an opponent may show. And no fighters are more vicious than the rowdy, battle-loving warriors of Withog, Ghazghkull, who revel in the act of smashing their adversaries. Ghazghkull is their strategic match, or more, as some of the Imperium's top tactical thinkers have already discovered. However, the news is getting worse for those who are opposed to the impending Green Wave. Ghazghkull's hordes are increasing in size and skill, and he is attracting not only mindless followers willing to do his bidding, but also powerful warlords who would not bend before any other orc's dominion save Ghazghkull's. Ghazghkull, confident in his own unrivaled superiority, has avoided a frequent trap among his green-skinned kin, trying to handle everything oneself. Other warlords believe that they must always lead from the front, spearheading all attacks while keeping a close eye on their own lieutenants, as well as the enemy. After all, it is a personal disaster for a warlord to be outdone by any of his subordinates in deeds. Ghazghkull, on the other hand, has such overwhelming authority that he doesn't need to be so cautious. Instead, he strategically places his men where their skills are most needed, demonstrating his age-old maxim, "Don't send a speed freak to do a dread mob's job." Ghazghkull now commands the biggest force of greenskins seen in millennia, thanks to his strategic skill, adaptability, and sheer force of character. This great Withog isn't just about to destroy a few planets or trample a few star systems. It's on a collision course with the entire galaxy. Ghazghkull's banner bearer, Makari Makari. Makari was a particularly fortunate grot, having lived to the ripe old age of 9 standard years before succumbing to his gigantic master's posterior by mistake. Gretchen served as the great Ghazghkull Thraka's self-appointed banner waver, surviving several conflicts in increasingly implausible ways. Makari was seen as a mascot by Ghazghkull. Makari's Waven stick was retrieved, hosed down, and repurposed as an amazing boss bowl when the grot's remains were peeled off his boss's rear end. Gretchen Makari, Ghazghkull's standard bearer, appears to be still alive and serving his king. Da Lucky Stick is still surrounded by good fortune. However, the fallout when things go wrong can be quite harsh. Makari has been seen following Ghazghkull into battle in the era Indomitus. Hence, the narrative of his death after being sat on by Ghazghkull may have been invented by Imperial propagandists wanting to shame the great orc warlord. It's also plausible that Ghazghkull is volunteering new grots in exchange for the honor of becoming his standard bearer, and that each Makari has had a life as brief as any other grot among the greenskins, dying in battle or by chance. Makari's lengthy survival is due to the fact that he is not your average Gretchen. He is harder, more resilient, and stronger than the rest of his family. Makari wields a stabber rather than the grot blasters wielded by his Gretchen brethren, preferring to battle up close and personal. It's a fairly effective weapon, and Makari has even used it to dispatch a Tempestus scion. Withog, Ghazghkull had grown unimaginably huge, Yet the Greenskins who accompanied him on his first invasion of Armageddon were mostly from Uruk and its environs. Ghazghkull has united the various tribes in his goal of wreaking havoc, and while he can get the most out of any Greenskin, he favors specific mobs or warbands above all others. The Withog is dynamos. Despite what Orc Tales claimed, Ghazghkull Thraka's genuine genius had nothing to do with his rock-splitting headbutt. Ghazghkull's leadership was what set him distinct. His ability to elicit the best performance from every orc made him extremely deadly. Few warlords can bring the many clans together, appealing to each one's strengths rather than allowing them to pursue their own narrow interests. Ghazghkull preferred a hardened combat corps of Goth warriors, but he always chose the best tool for the job. Ghazghkull, on the other hand, had a knack for detecting orcs who were destined for greatness. Withog, strewn around. Ghazghkull were a collection of the galaxy's finest skilled orcs. This was not a formal council, but rather a loose ring comprising the tribe's most powerful and prominent war bosses, as well as the most ambitious oddboys. Orkheims, the genius mech behind such discoveries as teleporter technology and attack submersibles, was perhaps the most famous of this group. Mad Doc Grotznik, the evil Sun's warlord Zagboss Skargrim, the old but still formidable Snakebite Grand Tusk Chieftain Moloch, militant-minded Commandant Clank of the Blood Axes, Nazdrag of the Bad Moons, and probably a dozen others were also in this company when he remained lucid. These tenacious lieutenants acted in Ghazghkull's name even while he wasn't around, ensuring that his intentions were carried out. In essence, they became Withog, Ghazghkull's right hands. Hordes of the Green. Orc armies are barbarous and chaotic hordes to non-greenskins, a ragged assemblage with no rhyme or reason. Despite their appearance as shambolic hordes, orcs are exceedingly hierarchical, and any Withog has a precise order and takes on the character of the orc who commands them. Ghazghkull relies on a hardened core of mobs and warbands since his Withog has become so enormous. These armies have been organized in the manner that the great prophet of Gork and Mork wants. Their leaders have trained to battle not just with their own fierce initiative, but also with strategies and cunning instilled by their brilliant leader. Warriors, mobs, and formations that are tasked with the most tough and severe of missions, such as spearheading major assaults or attacking important positions. History of the game. Ghazghkull made his debut in White Dwarf 134. He was the war boss of Andy Chambers' Samplegoth army list, at the time the weaker of two possible orc army leaders, the other being a warlord. His attributes of an adamantium skull and the ability to call on the Withog were randomly generated, though at the time they only conferred an extra headbutt attack in close combat and a minor psychic power, Cal. The first Ghazghkull model was created in-house. Ghazghkull's next appearance was in the Battle for Armageddon board game, where he starred alongside Commissar Yarrick and was based on the events of the Second War for Armageddon.